Canada just made a bold move that could change everything. Instead of depending on one powerful neighbor, it is opening new doors around the world. This could bring more strength and freedom to Canada, while the US risks losing a partner it once counted on. What happens next could reshape the future for both countries. Prime Minister Mark Carney stood at the University of Ottawa and said something no Canadian Prime Minister has said in the modern era of North American trade. The decades-long process of an ever closer economic relationship between the Canadian and American economies is over. Not paused, not under review, over. Carney set a specific target that evening: double Canada's non-US exports within the next decade. At the time he said it, more than 75% of everything Canada sells to the world goes to a single buyer. The plan announced that night was to cut that dependency in half. The number that frames the entire story is 75%. For more than a century, the United States has been Canada's overwhelming primary customer, at times accounting for as much as 80 to 85% of total Canadian exports during periods of peak integration. As of late 2025, more than 75% of Canadian exports still go to the United States. Canada is the top export destination for 36 American states. Nearly 3.6 billion Canadian dollars, approximately 2.7 billion US dollars worth of goods and services crosses the border every single day. That volume of daily integrated trade is what a century of economic convergence produces. And it is precisely that convergence Carney now describes as Canada's central vulnerability. The jobs of workers in our industries most affected by US tariffs, autos, steel, lumber, are under threat. Our businesses are holding back investments, restrained by the pall of uncertainty that is hanging over all of us, Carney said. The catalyst for the shift was specific and datable. American tariffs on Canadian autos, steel, aluminum, and lumber raised to levels that Carney described as last seen during the Great Depression, converted a structural advantage into a structural exposure overnight. A trading relationship built on the assumption of frictionless cross-border integration cannot absorb 25 to 50% tariffs without the country on the smaller end of the relationship experiencing disproportionate damage. Canadian auto plants are producing approximately 30% fewer vehicles than the prior year. Algoma Steel posted a $159.4 million net loss in a single quarter with $27.4 million in direct tariff costs. The exposure Carney identified was not theoretical. It was already showing up in quarterly earnings reports. By April 2026, Carney sharpened the framing further. Speaking days after securing a majority government following special election wins, he described Canada's economic relationship with the United States in stark terms. What was once a strength has become a weakness. We have to take care of ourselves because we can't rely on one foreign partner, he said. The US has changed and we must respond. It's about taking back control of our security, our borders, and our future. That statement, delivered with a fresh electoral mandate, moved the diversification strategy from a policy proposal into a governing mandate with the political capital to execute it. The international travel schedule that followed October 2025 reflects the scale of the diversification effort. Carney traveled to China in January 2026, a notable destination given the historically cautious Canadian approach to Chinese economic engagement, and one that drew attention specifically because Canada has not considered the United States a military threat since the mid-19th century, yet found itself simultaneously managing a deepening trade relationship with China, while American rhetoric about Greenland and continental dominance unsettled long-held assumptions about North American security arrangements. We are re-engaging with the global giants India and China, Carney said in October 2025, naming the two most populous countries on Earth as explicit targets of Canada's diversification. The Indo-Pacific dimension extends beyond China to include Japan, Australia, and India as central pillars of Canada's long-term economic plan. European engagement runs in parallel. The Canada-EU Security and Defence Partnership signed in December. 2025 opened defence industrial cooperation, and Canada's broader trade diversification toward Europe includes the aluminum, hydrogen, and critical minerals partnerships that have accelerated through 2026. Each of these relationships represents export capacity that does not depend on decisions made in Washington. The domestic component of Carney's strategy is where the diversification effort becomes structurally significant rather than simply diplomatically active. On March 21st, 2025, in his first meeting with Canada's premiers, Carney committed to what he called Free Trade by Canada Day, eliminating federal barriers to interprovincial trade and labor mobility by July 1st, 2025. The agreement is to turn what has been a concept into a reality that will diversify and strengthen our economy, Carney said at that meeting. We are committing to removing all federal exemptions under the Canada Free Trade Agreement. The Free Trade and Labor Mobility in Canada Act received royal assent on June 26, 2025, removing all federal exceptions under the Canadian Free Trade Agreement and establishing the Canadian Internal Trade Data and Information Hub. The economic estimate attached to full internal trade liberalization is substantial, eliminating all federal, provincial, and territorial internal trade barriers could boost Canadian GDP by as much as $200 billion over time, equivalent to $5,100 per person. Internal trade expert Ryan Mnuchin described the federal legislation's actual function precisely. It's a starting gun, and it's starting a lot more activity and work, which is honestly the really exciting part. If any of this was easy, it would have been done. The fine print matters here. Carney's Free Trade by Canada Day promise specifically addressed federal-level barriers, the regulations Ottawa controls. The majority of Canada's internal trade barriers exist at the provincial level, governed by the Canadian Free Trade Agreement that took effect in 2017, and that still permits provinces considerable leeway to protect local industries through exceptions. Canada's supply-managed dairy and poultry sectors remain outside the liberalization entirely. Provinces including Nova Scotia, Quebec, and Ontario have signed bilateral memoranda of understanding and introduced legislation removing some of their own exceptions, but a fully barrier-free internal Canadian market remains. In Mnuchin's words, the start of a conversation rather than the final word. The strategic logic connecting internal trade reform to the broader diversification push is direct. A Canadian company that can sell freely into every province without navigating province-specific certification, licensing, and regulatory requirements becomes a larger, more efficient domestic platform better positioned to scale toward export markets in Europe, Asia, and the Indo-Pacific. As we move from reliance to resilience, we are building one Canadian economy so that we can become our own best customer, the federal government stated in November 2025. By May 28, 2026, Carney's framing had evolved further, still describing the moment not as a bilateral trade dispute, but as a world undergoing rupture, requiring Canada to seek a new partnership model with the United States rather than a restoration of the old one. The geographic reality Carney has acknowledged throughout this entire process remains unchanged. The United States shares a 5,525-mile border with Canada, buys the majority of Canadian exports, and cannot be replaced as a trading partner through diversification alone. Even Carney's own goal, doubling non-US exports by 2035, would still leave the United States as Canada's largest single trading partner by a wide margin.